Great, thank you, Vitaly. Yeah, I'm excited to be speaking at DevTernity, and like Vitaly says, I'm coming at you from entirely the opposite end of the world in Melbourne, Australia, where I am right now. All right, here we go. So I want to talk to you today about improving eBay's development velocity. So until a couple of months ago, I was the chief architect and VP of engineering for eBay, where I ran eBay's internal development platform organization. And I want to talk to you today about some really interesting and exciting results that we got by an initiative where we were just trying to improve our ability to deliver software effectively. And I'm really proud of the results that we got, and hopefully they can be inspiring and helpful and good learning for everybody here. Okay, so as always, let's start with what problem statement we have. Like, what problem are we trying to even solve? So the problem here is that eBay's overall product velocity was lagging the industry leaders. And we wanted to make it not just that eBay's development velocity was, okay, but we wanted to turn eBay's development velocity into a real competitive advantage for the company. And so how did eBay get here? Well, eBay's a 27-year-old company. It was started in 1995. So a lot of stuff is built up over time. And so what we realized is that there were really systemic challenges across the company. There's really no one particular area that contributed to the development thing slowing down. So as a consequence, there was no real single silver bullet. It involved people from all aspects of all the different roles of product and business and development and operations and all sorts of stuff. It involved changes in our processes and how we developed software, how we thought about software, how we figured out what to build, and then also changes to the technology. Because again, we had 27 years to build up our technology portfolio. But the great thing about approaching one of these sets of problems in the year 2022, or when we started back in 2020, is that many companies have already successfully navigated this journey. And so we really have the benefit of being able to look at a bunch of our industry peers and learn from what they've done, and learn from a bunch of the industry research that we're going to talk about later on. So when I first arrived at the company, again, about 2.5 years ago, because I'd worked at eBay before, earlier in my career, I basically tried to assess where we were in terms of product development, because I came back to do this work, but I wanted to see kind of where we were. So the way I like to think about it is, the product life cycle is sort of divided into, for me, these 4 different phases. So what I'll call the planning phase is how somebody's great idea becomes a project that people work on. The software development phase is how does one of those projects become committed code? Software delivery is how that committed code becomes a feature on the site that provides value to the business and to customers. And then I always like to add this additional phase, which is post-release iteration. So once the feature is out there providing value to customers, how do we use analytics and experimentation to iterate on the feature to provide even more value to customers? And as part of trying to assess where we were with this, I did what's called a value stream map. So I looked with a bunch of different, a cross section of individual teams across the company, and tried to assess, with their help, to where we were on all these areas. And it turns out that we have challenges in every little area. So in terms of the planning phase, there's lots of, when we're trying to decide what to do, there's lots of inter-team coordination. Lots of teams dependent on other teams to get their work done, and almost every team or organization that we talk with at eBay had too much work in progress. In terms of software development, developers would be challenged by long build and testing cycles. So their inner loop was, slowed down by taking a long time to build and test the software. Developers continually told us that they were having to context switch between different things that they were working on, and they were often in wait states, waiting for other people to do work that they needed or that they relied upon. And then again, over 27 years, eBay had built up a pretty coupled architecture. So there were lots of pieces of the architecture that over time we'd like to decouple and make more independent of each other. eBay hasn't had until now a strong history of well-defined service contracts between the individual services, and so that was something an opportunity that we identified. And almost everybody told us that there was lots of hidden work. So there'd be, a bunch of features that they'd be working on at, a particular, at the kind of higher level, but there was lots of hidden work associated with getting stuff done that in order to deliver those features effectively. In terms of the software delivery part of the life cycle, so we have a pretty effective, continuous integration and continuous delivery environment, but not every team and every service and every application was using that effectively. So we found a lot of cases where, there weren't the deployment pipelines weren't as effective or as comprehensive as we'd want them to be. We identified that there were lots of issues in our staging environment. So, teams trying to test in a common environment, would step on each other's toes, and there was a lot of reliability issues there. We had more manual testing than any of us would have liked, and to me, there should be zero. So, that was definitely an opportunity as well. Interestingly, there wasn't a fully automated rollout capability. So, we always had automated rollouts, but the way that it had worked traditionally is that, in order for something to be deployed and move from stage to stage to stage, somebody would actually have to press a button in order for it to move from one stage to another stage. And we wanted to make sure that we could do fully automated deployments. We didn't have a canary deployment capability, so that was something that that we saw as an opportunity. And then, even though eBay was one of the original kind of co-inventors of feature flags way back 20 years ago, not every team and every application and every service was using feature flags effectively. And then in the post-release iteration area, so while we had very good end-to-end monitoring of the system health, so operational metrics were pretty strong, we didn't have as much end-to-end monitoring of the customer experience as we would like, particularly, particularly concentrated in the particular, in the flows that customers use to get their stuff done at eBay. We had a bunch of issues in tracking customer behavior. And then we had what I like to call dysfunctional experimentation, where, some teams would almost be over-experimenting, like they'd be afraid to move forward with new initiatives without months upon months of A/B tests. And then there were a bunch of teams, maybe the majority of teams, that weren't doing experimentation as much as we'd like for their part. So there are lots of issues here, and we didn't want to, there's no way we were going to tackle them all in the same, at one go. So what we decided to focus on was these particular center areas. So we decided to focus on the software development and then mostly on the software delivery parts of the life cycle. And the reason we chose this is because what we heard again and again from teams is that this is the bottleneck. This is the area where there are real opportunities to make the teams a lot more productive. And that's actually what we found in doing this work. So, but the other reason is that by focusing on software delivery, it actually makes all the other things that we want to do possible by enabling faster change and by reducing the cost of change. So, I mentioned the highly coupled architecture that we have. As chief architect, I definitely wanted to do a bunch of re-architecture projects. But what we noticed is that we needed to be able to deliver software a lot faster in smaller increments of work and do that safely and reliably and repeatably in order for us to, in order for that to enable us to do larger things like change the architecture. Okay, so now that we've identified what the problem is, now we want to figure out how we can measure whether we're making progress or not. And so again, what's lovely about having these problems or these issues in the modern world is that there's a ton of industry research that talks about how to measure software delivery effectively. And so I hope a lot of us are familiar with the state of DevOps surveys, and a bunch of the science behind that is summarized in this very excellent book by Dr. Nicole Forsgren called Accelerate. And so if you're not familiar, the state of DevOps surveys have been going on now for 9 years. They've involved tens of thousands of survey responses from people all over the world. And then basically, thanks to Dr. Forsgren, a very rigorous scientific methodology in trying to sort out what things actually matter to improving software delivery outcomes and what things don't. And again, if you haven't read this book, then I suggest that as soon as this conference is over, that you go out and buy it and read it, because because it's a great summary of all the things that help to make software delivery better. So one of the things that all this research shows us is that actually software organizations tend to cluster. So on the metrics that I'm about to talk about in a moment, it turns out that organizations that are poor on some of the metrics tend to be poor on all of the metrics. Organizations that are okay on some of the metrics tend to be okay on all of the metrics. And organizations that are really good at some of the metrics tend to be really good at all of the metrics. So that's one thing that you can take away from these kind of cohorts or groupings. But the other thing that you should notice here is that the average company is getting better. So between 2018 to 2019, and then again between 2019 and 2021, the number of organizations that are in those high and elite categories are getting larger, and the number of organizations that are in the lower performing categories are getting smaller. So the implication there is that if you and your organization are staying constant, you're actually falling behind relative to your industry peers. So it's kind of like the Red Queen effect. We need to keep moving in order even just to keep the same relative performance relative to the industry. So when we talk about these high performing, low performing, medium performing categories, what do we really mean? So people are maybe familiar with these, accelerate metrics or DORA metrics or the 4 key metrics, but what they are 2 speed metrics and 2 stability metrics. So the first metric is around deployment frequency. So for any given application, how often are we deploying that application or service to production and providing customer value? Lead time for change is about when a developer is finished with her code. How long does it take between when she's committed her code to that feature showing up and then providing value to the business and to customers? Time to restore service is when we have some customer impacting issue. How long does it take us to resolve that issue in a way and get back to a good state? And then change failure rate finally is what's the percentage of time, what's the percentage of those deployments that we do that we end up having to roll back or hotfix or patch in some other way. So it's something that we can't leave, that we have to fix right away. And then the way to read these kind of columns is how long or effective do the low performers, medium performers, high performers, and elite performers do at these metrics. And I'm not going to read every individual one, but the way to look at it is for the low performers, a bunch of these things are measured in months, deployment frequency and lead time and time to restore service. For the medium performers, these things are measured in weeks. For the high performers, these things are measured in days. And for the elite performers, these things are measured in hours. So, you can see that there are kind of order of magnitude improvements as you go from, one category of organization to another category of organization. So these are kind of the industry standard metrics and the industry standard clustering of where organizations lie. Well, where does eBay fall on it? Thank you for asking. So it turns out before we started this work that the average application at eBay was sort of a solidly medium performer. So the deployment frequency on, let's call it any particular application or service would maybe be deployed, once every week and a half. Lead time for change would be something similar. Time to restore service for a major outage would be a day or a little bit longer. And then eBay's always been pretty good on the change failure rate, so that was down at sort of 3%. And then I'll quickly tell you, where the results that we got from the work that we did, and then I'll spend the rest of this talk talking about how we achieved those results. So I'm pretty proud to say that for all the teams that we work with in this initial effort, we were able to move all of them from the medium performing categories to the high performing categories. So we were able to quintuple, multiply by 5 times or improve by 5 times the deployment frequency. We were able to improve by 5 times the lead time for change. And even though we were only focused on those speed metrics, exactly as the research shows, we were also able to move the stability metrics. So we actually improved the time to restore service by 3x, and we also improved our change failure rate, which was already pretty good, by 3x as well. So I'm pretty proud of those results. But I guess, maybe the most important thing that actually mattered to the business overall is that we actually doubled the engineering productivity for the teams that we work with. And when I say engineering productivity, what do I mean? Because there's lots of bad ways of measuring engineering productivity. What I'm talking about is the team's ability to deliver features and bug fixes. So what we found is for the teams that we work with, holding the team size and the composition constant. In other words, it's the same exact team as they had before. They were now, after this work, able to deliver twice the features and bug fixes in any given period of time as they were able to before. So this has a huge impact on the ability of eBay to improve the lives of our customers. Okay. Well, so that's kind of the results. Now let's kind of back up and talk about how we achieved those results. So the kind of initiative that what we ended up starting was this thing that we ended up internally calling the Velocity Initiative. And the general philosophy here was to think big, to start small, and to learn fast. And again, because we didn't want to kind of boil the ocean, we didn't want to start by working with every individual team, every application all at once. And I guess as a sidebar, I should have mentioned that eBay has about 4,000 engineers and about 4,500 applications and services. So we definitely didn't think it was going to be effective to try to work with all 4,000 engineers and work with all 4,500 applications all at once out of the gate. So instead, what we decided to do was focus on a select set of pilot domains. So, particular product areas that represented a cross section across all of eBay. So we didn't want to choose working with just one particular team. We wanted to make sure that the improvements that we made were generalizable across all of the different teams at eBay. And so we chose a cross section of a bunch of different teams from a bunch of different areas in order to get started with. And some of those domains would have hundreds of applications and services overall that they would support. And so even so within those domains, with those, in conjunction with those teams, we chose a bunch of pilot applications to work with. So we wanted to, again, make sure that we focused on particular, high value applications and services that would, where the difference that we make would make a big difference. And then I'll talk about a bunch of this in a moment, but we also spun up a bunch of platform tracks. Again, I was on the kind of platform and infrastructure side, and my teams were about building common tools and platforms and frameworks that were leveraged by the rest of eBay. And so we spun up a bunch of platform tracks that that would try to address the impediments that we heard from the pilot domains and the pilot application teams. And so our goal here was to drive improvements in developer productivity. We wanted to make sure that we drove improvements in the software delivery outcomes that we had as a company. And then we also wanted to make sure that we drove improvements in instrumentation and monitoring as well. And we didn't want to just, start working, go in a hole, and then produce value only, a year later. So we wanted to make sure that we were both delivering short-term wins for the individual teams and also long-term capabilities that lasted for a long period of time. And the other thing, even though this was mostly not a re-architecture project, we did realize that there were some particular areas of the company or of the software that we did want to re-architect because they would make such a big difference. And so, one of the areas that we started with is what we internally at eBay call view item. So if you ever looked at eBay or used the site, view item is essentially the product page. And so, you can imagine that almost everything that, about buying or bidding on something at eBay ultimately goes through that page. And then what we also found is that, again, back to all the interdependencies and coordination issues that we found in planning phases, is that almost every large scale initiative at the company ultimately ended up making changes to this particular page. So it was important that we both modularize and modernize the software that was underlying that area of the site. And then we also spent a bunch of time re-architecting the mobile applications, so the iOS and Android applications, where a lot of people, or actually the vast majority of people, are using to buy and sell things on eBay today. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the platform tracks that we spun up and the pilot domains. And how do we figure out what platform tracks even to work on? Well, what we would do is we would go to individual teams and we would say, well, it looks like you're deploying, the applications that you have each individually, once or twice a month. If I told you had to deploy every application every single day, tell me all the reasons why you can't. And the team would say, well, how long do you have, Randy? And they would give us this big long list of all the issues that they ran into. And fortunately, leading the platform team, I was able to say, great, you just gave me our team's backlog. So the first platform track that we had was simply measuring velocity. So we wanted to make sure that we had a consistent set of dashboards that allowed teams to see where they were on those 4 key metrics that I mentioned, and also be able to drill in and really understand, what are the contributions to particularly their lead time, try to figure out, what they can do to be better. We wanted to make sure that we spun up a track that was around developer productivity. So this is, trying to make sure that inner loop for developers is really fast. In particular, also we noticed that we heard consistent feedback that build and startup time was a real productivity killer for the developers, and so several of my teams worked on instrumenting the build process and making sure that building a bunch of tools that really gave us observability into the build, and to maybe sometimes automatically, but certainly in terms of an observability perspective, show teams what they could do to improve their build time. A lot of those things actually were able to be done automatically, which was great. And then we did a similar set of tools around startup time, where again we instrumented the startup of the applications in production in a way that allowed us a lot more observability, and so we were able to look at the bottlenecks and resolve them. We spent a bunch of time improving local testing for developers. So this is, making sure that, as they're in that tight inner loop, that they're able to test locally on their laptop for the stuff that they're working on in an effective and efficient way. And then over time, we also introduced contract testing for interactions between the services. We spent a bunch of time improving our continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines. So we made them much easier to use, much more reliable, a lot more feature rich. And so we really spent a bunch of time on improving that aspect of the developer experience there. We spent a bunch of time, as I mentioned before, trying improving our staging environment. So again, making sure that it was really easy for developers to spin up test data, to manage the dependencies between the services, and also a lot of improvement in the reliability of the overall environment. We also introduced a capability that we call traffic mirroring. So we didn't invent this, but I have yet to hear like an industry standard term for it. So, when I say traffic mirroring, what do I mean? I mean, we're trying to, so the problem statement is we're trying to build a new version of a particular service. And so we'll take real production traffic that's going to the existing service of version N, and then we'll tee that traffic, and we'll send those requests to a new N+1 version of the software that we're thinking about deploying, and then we'll compare the results of the N version and the N+1 version. And if the results are the same, then we have a lot more confidence that the thing we're about to deploy is effective. You can imagine that in a 27-year-old company with 4,500 applications and services, that not every one of them is fully instrumented in automated testing as you'd like. A lot of things are very well tested, but a lot of legacy applications aren't. And so this traffic mirroring gives us a kind of black box way of testing and making sure that it's safe to roll out a new version. We spent a bunch of time on improving deployment automation. So we introduced a canary deployment capability. So, when triggered by a commit, we would build, test, and deploy the software, and that software would get deployed, in successive stages. So, a staged rollout of, let's say, 1% of the fleet, 10% of the fleet, et cetera. And the pipeline would automatically monitor the metrics, and then if the metrics were good, we would keep rolling out all the way to 100%. And if the metrics didn't look good, then they would automatically roll back. So end-to-end deployment automation with no touch by any human. And then last, a lot of these things for a bunch of the engineers were kind of new to them. And so we spent a bunch of effort on training and workshops and, helping engineers understand the new ways that we were building and deploying software. And so, we did a bunch of pilot domains, and the details aren't important here, but the idea here is to take away what I was saying before, which is there really are a cross section of of a bunch of different domains across the company. So we didn't want to, spend only our effort in the payments area and, have people feel like, the improvements that we made were kind of only unique to that area. So, we worked across domains in a cross section across the entire company. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about how did we kind of work, and how did we achieve these results. So the first aspect is we spent a lot of time collaborating. So the history before I arrived as leader of the platform team was the platform and infrastructure side kind of were on one side of a wall, and then the kind of domain and product engineering side were on another side of the wall, and they didn't collaborate together as much as as we'd like. So one of the great things that we did from the very beginning of this initiative was we actually had cross-functional leadership. So I had a partner who was another VP of engineering in the kind of product domain side, and so he and I co-led this initiative, and so we were able to break down a bunch of barriers and silos and make a lot of forward progress. We also had an embedding model, or if you're familiar with the team topologies terminology, I put together an enabling team where I brought in a bunch of a small number of really senior kind of architect-y, senior individual contributor folks, and then we would send them out into the provinces and have them help teams individually in a very tight feedback loop, help them get better. And then more generally, every time we did one of those platform tracks, or we added a new capability like the canary deployments, or like traffic mirroring, or build improvements, we would always make sure that we signed up teams to be piloting the work that we were doing. So one of my strong rules was we're never going to starting when I took over the team, we're never going to build new capabilities that don't have people that teams already signed up to use, and kind of that can be like alpha and beta customers for our work. And that was both on the I'll call it problem identification side. So we're constantly working with the teams to ask them, okay, well, what are your bottlenecks now that we've solved this? What are your bottlenecks now? Help us understand, what you're blocked by now. And then also, again, on the solution side, where we had my platform teams and the kind of consumer domain or product teams working together on building out the new capabilities. We spent a bunch of time, we really emphasized communication. So my partner in crime and I had daily leadership stand-ups. So we actually met together every single day for a half an hour to make sure we could unblock each other and help each other out. We had a weekly, what we called team of teams meeting, where we had a representative from all the teams that were involved in this initiative, all kind of get together for an hour every week. And you could think of it as a kind of team level stand-up. So, everybody said really quickly, what their team was working on, what they were maybe blocked by, what they were going to do next. So kind of standard stand-up stuff. But that was also a great opportunity for teams to share their wins, share the things that they were blocked by. And a lot of times what we found is teams would help each other out, and the kind of central platform team didn't need to be involved in a lot of those things. We also set up weekly deep dives with the individual teams. So every week we would meet individually with the team, with each individual team that was involved in this initiative, and that was an opportunity for us to get really hands-on and help that team with whatever they were challenged by. It was an opportunity for us to get very direct feedback on what things were working and what things weren't. And then we also did a monthly operating review with the executive team. In terms of measurement, we invested in building out a dashboard, that I mentioned with that measured those 4 key metrics for every one of those 4,500 applications across the company, so that was really valuable. Just like being able to see where everybody is allowed us to figure out what areas we needed to focus on and what areas we needed to prioritize. That dashboard also gave teams granular visibility into the entire delivery pipeline. So every time they would deploy their software, we had instrumented that process, and so they could drill in and figure out, what things were potential areas of improvement and what things were doing really well. And then for each of those platform tracks that I mentioned, we identified a bunch of input metrics. Here are our target. Here's our baseline for build time for this application, and here are the improvements that we made. That kind of thing. And that measurement allowed us to again see where the progress was happening, and allowed us to focus on making improvements. We iterated a lot. So our main goal was to improve the impediments to flow that the teams told us about. Again, what would tell us all the reasons why you can't deploy every day, and let's iterate on those together. And we would do what is called in the kind of lean software, lean area, a plan, do, check, act cycle. This is also sometimes called the Deming cycle because it's named after W. Edwards Deming, one of the founders of lean. Plan. So we would design an experiment, or we would figure out something that we might want to do. That's the plan part. We would do the experiment. We would, make that small change. We would check to see if that small change made an improvement in the thing that we were trying to do. If it did, great, we'll continue doing that for everybody. If not, we'll roll it back and try something else. And so we actually had several of the things that we tried, we thought were going to make a difference. And we ended up not seeing the improvement that we wanted. So we ended up stopping those efforts and, focusing on areas that were making a big difference. And then again, as I mentioned before, we spent a bunch of time educating teams and engineers on working in this new way. So we made a lot of investment in training and workshops and so on. So again, as I mentioned, the initiative results were pretty exciting. So again, as I mentioned, we doubled the productivity of the pilot teams that we work with. And again, what that meant was, holding the team size constant, that they were delivering twice the features and bug fixes as they had been able to do before. Oh, and then I didn't mention in specific, but the pilot that we did in 2020, or rather in 2021, was with 10% of the actively developed apps on the site. And again, as I mentioned, we improved the deployment frequency 5x from 10 days to 2 days, or from something like twice a month to more than twice a week. The lead time improved 5x from 10 days to 2 days on average. And again, even though we weren't focused on change failure rate and time to recover, both of those improved 3x as well. And we had this laser focus on identifying the bottlenecks and removing them as we went along. So we had teams reduce their, we were able to reduce the build and startup times for teams. Teams spent a bunch of time reducing their PR validation times to validate pull requests. We invested very heavily, as I mentioned, in the staging environment. We also spent a bunch of time on automated upgrades, on automated testing, on automated deployment, and on automated monitoring of performance, or what we would call site speed, customer experienced performance. Along the way, we streamlined a bunch of team processes. Teams would find that actually code reviews were sometimes a bottleneck in their ability to deliver software. So a lot of teams would changed around their code review policies, and a lot of teams would, for example, like after their daily stand-up, that would be the time when they'd make sure to do all the pending code reviews. So nothing would wait longer than 24 hours in that area. And then a bunch of teams also streamlined this kind of legacy sign-off process where teams would want to sign off on other teams' deployments. And then And then one of the other things that I was super proud of is that we moved from monthly releases of our iOS and Android apps to weekly releases. And amusingly to me, when I initially proposed, at the beginning of 2021, hey, I see we deploy our apps monthly. Let's make sure that let's try to see if we can do it weekly. The most skeptical people were exactly my mobile release team. So they said, Randy, you're crazy. There's no way we're going to be able to do that. And I said, well, let's give it a try. And so what ended up happening is, I was hoping to do it by the end of that year. They told me I was crazy. So we moved from monthly releases to biweekly releases in, let's call it May or April or May of the year, and that wasn't so bad. And then we decided in July to move to do one time where we did a weekly release instead of a biweekly release, and it went so well that we ended up moving to weekly releases at that point. So I'm pretty proud to say that in 5 months earlier than the Randy, you're crazy deadline, we were able to get to weekly mobile releases. And what weekly mobile releases actually means is pretty exciting. So the typical week for the mobile app looks something like this. Well, it used to be that we would do a code freeze, and we would let's say on January 1st, and it would take hardening and all sorts of stuff by take maybe till January 21st until we could start the process of actually rolling it out, and then it would take a week to roll it out. Whereas now on Wednesday we do the freeze, or more precisely we just take the main branch as of Wednesday. We run 24 hours worth of automated testing, do a bunch of that in parallel. On Thursday, we're ready to release to the app stores. We get approved immediately in Android, and then, Apple usually takes a day. And so by Friday, we're able to ramp those things up to 1%. We choose to let that 1% sort of bake over the weekend in case there are any issues, and then we turn everything to 100% on Monday. And so we talk about that as weekly releases, but the way I like to think about it is at any moment we could decide to release the app, and 24 hours later we could get it in the App Store. So that's pretty exciting. Okay, in terms of culture and behavior, one of the things that made this more successful than previous efforts at the company is we really injected this feeling of excitement and fun into the work. So that at that weekly team of teams meeting, it was a great opportunity for teams to share their improvements in their metrics, and sort of ended up being a kind of friendly competition where teams were a little bit competing with each other to see the improvements that they could make, and they were inspiring each other to improve. Actually, one of the other things that I'm proud of is that teams that weren't part of the program, noticed their sister teams being a lot more productive and a lot happier in their work, and they ended up actually kind of forcing their way into the program. So that was pretty cool. And universally, the engineers that were involved in this work never want to go back to the old ways at all. In terms of collaboration, one of the previous history was that it wasn't pathological culture that existed before. It actually wasn't particularly safe for teams to highlight that they were running into issues. That wasn't always interpreted in the way that in a healthy way. And so one of the things that we did as part of this work was making sure that it was psychologically safe for teams to highlight their impediments outside the team. That it was okay to say, what, we're actually running into build issues, and we're running into testing issues, et cetera. And we also needed to collaborate with a bunch of other teams, the security teams, compliance, accessibility, localization. So there was a bunch of partnering cross-functionally with other teams at the company as well. In terms of community and sharing, so one of the things that we found is that teams would end up automating their own workflows. It used to be that only the platform teams would produce tools and the domain teams would consume them, but the teams started building their own workflows, which was great. We did regular team demos of new tools and new practices, and teams were really incented to share tools and learnings with each other. We had a bunch of executive support and engagement. So the CEO was constantly highlighting at our company all hands and executive meetings, that this is the most important initiative at the company, and the only thing he wanted was for us to go faster. And we also exposed it at earnings reports and to the board of directors. So in terms of this year, we expanded from that initial 10% pilot to half of the applications at the company. And by the time we reached the middle of the year, we were already oversubscribed in our initial cohorts. And so we ended up putting together a playbook, which is sort of like a paved path of here are effective ways that teams have found at eBay to improve. We had a sort of problem solution model, like when you have this particular problem with lead time or whatever, here are some of the potential solutions that you can use. And we collected together the tools and best practices with specific examples from within the company and within our technology stack. And again, we put together a bunch of training videos, et cetera, and links to further resources. Another related initiative, which I'm not going to talk about in a huge amount of detail, was making sure that we're constantly upgrading the dependencies in our software. So people probably are aware, one of the best ways to shut down security vulnerabilities is to just simply keep the software up to date. And so before I had arrived, those site-wide upgrades, as we called them, weren't happening very often. So in some cases they were happening only once a year. And so we moved first to doing them quarterly and making sure that every application was up to date quarterly, and then now everything is monthly. So this allows, even for those applications that aren't actively maintained, which is a significant portion of those 4,500 applications, that we're still practicing regular deployments and making sure that all the dependencies stay up to date. And that kind of puts a kind of carrot and stick together, in terms of automation and improvements, right? So the carrot is all this velocity work about removing impediments, and the stick is, and by this deadline, everything needs to be upgraded, kind of no matter what. And then we continued modernizing the mobile application. So we're continuing to make even more improvements to that weekly release cycle that I mentioned, moving the mobile app interfaces to the server to GraphQL, and leveraging the modern UI frameworks of Swift UI on iOS and Jetpack Compose on Android. But everything's not all, rainbows and unicorns. So there are some ongoing challenges. So, what I told you is that we were able to improve team level outputs. But one of the things that we're hoping to, that we did actually show this year, is improving overall eBay outcomes in terms of, an entire flow, as opposed to just particular, team level outputs. The initiative team, there's a lot of work here to do. So, the initiative team was taxed. We needed to make sure that the product teams did the work that they needed to do in order to make the improvements that we were talking about. One of the other challenges was, the kind of middle management or, engineering VPs and directors of the other areas. So I'm not sure I would have done this any differently, but we really started at the grassroots with the individual teams. But what we found is that we needed to spend more time on getting VPs and directors on board as well. So, a lot of times they would spend more time arguing about the metrics instead of improving their practices. Again, from the past sort of pathological culture, there was a fear of failure and a fear of consequences if going faster, seemed to imply that it would cause a bug or something like that. And not everybody, immediately from the beginning, believed in the program. The last thing I'd say here is it's pretty hard to change mindsets, particularly when people have been working in a particular way for a while. And a sobering statistic that I learned relatively recently is that, only 19% of these kinds of transformations, succeed, and 81% of them fail. So there's a lot of a lot of times companies have sort of immune systems that, that resist this kind of change. Okay, so what does the future look like? So the future looks like instead of planning all big planning up front, that we do rolling planning. We do small, cheap experiments, and only when those experiments are successful do we double down with big projects. We want to make sure that software development is done in really small batch sizes with really fast build and test iteration. We want to make sure that every engineer, at the very least, is merging and deploying software every day. And then we'd like to have a much more decoupled architecture. From a software delivery perspective, we want to make sure that we have a fully automated test and deploy pipeline. We'd like every application to be an hour or less from when somebody commits code to when it's deployed on the site. And then we'd like to be iterating in production with feature flags. In terms of post-release iteration, we want to make sure that there's effective end-to-end monitoring of the customer experience, that we have effective tracking everywhere, and again, that we do small, cheap experiments with rapid feedback on the results. So the last thing I want to say here, and then we'll have time for questions, is a few quick lessons and takeaways. So one of the things that I learned is that we really need to understand the problem before we can solve it. Once we've understood the problem, we want to focus and prioritize on those aspects of the problem that matter most. We want to collaborate across teams, both in defining what to work on and also in terms of the solutions that we put together. We want to iterate in small steps so that we're always making constant improvement. We want to optimize for feedback. We want to make sure that we're hearing from the teams whether things are making improvements for them. We want to measure our progress along the way. And then also, particularly importantly, we want to celebrate our successes, because that's going to make everybody much more motivated to continue forward. Okay, so I'm done. And now I'm ready to take some questions if we have some.
We have a lot of questions. It's actually the highest number of questions I have ever seen on the Eternity, 23, if I counted correctly. So let's pick up the most relevant one. So just give me a second. Let me find it. Yeah. Have you changed anything on how the development work was done? For example, introduce test-driven development, pair programming, trunk-based development, etc.
Yes, we did all of those things. And we were doing those at an individual team level, as opposed to making them kind of forced from an initiative level. But yeah, we did encourage teams to do all those things, to do test-driven development, to do pairing, and also to do trunk-based development. So all those things were aspects of the program as well. Yeah, great question.
Mm-hmm. So the next one. By pushing the velocity initiative, looking at the non-bright side, what did it not fix in the engineering dev processes? Did it create any new problems along the way? For example, tech people?
I mean, yeah, like I said, it wasn't all rainbows and unicorns. I mean, overall, everybody was a lot happier. Developers like to do their work and not be blocked by stuff. So for the most part, developers were happy. I mean, what did it not solve? I mean, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, like we intentionally focused on those like software development and software delivery areas, and we didn't focus as much on the upstream planning, which is super important. To make sure that we have a queue of work that makes sense. We didn't focus as much on the downstream kind of experimentation and learning. So there are lots of stuff still to do. And by the way, this work isn't done. Like, we moved to the high performer category, but like the elite performer is there too. So there's a lot more to do even on the stuff that we focused on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the next one is, what were the most valuable changes you introduced? Like, what exactly you did that had the biggest impact?
It was different for different teams, to be honest, but investing in the continuous delivery pipeline was probably the one thing that if I could only do one thing, it was improvements to the continuous delivery pipeline. I mean, it's hard to choose among your children, but that was the
yeah.
that's the one. If I had gun to my head, if I had to choose one.
All right. A lot of demonstrated knowledge applies quite specifically to the size of the company like eBay. How would you apply these ideas to a company which is significantly smaller? A fifth or
I
tenth the
think
size of the engineering department, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think the specifics of the impediments that we had are maybe specific to eBay. I mean, other companies have, build time issues and, whatever. But the general philosophy, I think, is applicable anywhere. And what's that general philosophy? It's, if you want to make improvements to developers' lives and team productivity, go and ask the developers and teams what they're blocked by and work on, take one or two of those and work on that, and then work on the next thing and work on the next thing. So that, I guess that's kind of what I was trying to summarize in that last slide of the lessons and takeaways is, the answer isn't make improvements in build time, because maybe that's not your problem. But the thing, the answer is figure out what your problems are, collaborate together on identifying and prioritizing and focusing on them, and then collaborate on the solutions.
Amazing. And the last question, if you have time, it would be great to hear more about the traffic mirroring. So the author assumed that you meant two-phase or canary deployment, but you also mentioned them separately. If you could
sorry,
mention,
I didn't get the last part of the question.
Yeah, the author assumed that you meant two-phase or canary deployment, but the author also thinks that you mentioned them as a separate thing.
Traffic mirroring and canary deployments are separate ideas, right?
Yeah.
Traffic mirroring is about, again, taking that production traffic and also sending it to a candidate, a candidate version that we're thinking about rolling out. And that's one part of that, build, test, and deploy cycle. And then the canary deployments are about, okay, now we're rolling it out, and what do the metrics look like in production? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you could, yeah, maybe I assume that there will be also some discussion about this in the comments. So just if you could address it, it would be great. For the rest, Renty, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk, and yeah, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Great. Thanks, Vitaly. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.